Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty ambitious. We are distilling over 12,000 years of complex, bloody, and honestly incredibly rich history into one central narrative, the continuous forging of the Irish identity. It's a story of pure survival, of adaptation, and of a culture that has profoundly influenced the world despite facing centuries of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our visual roadmap for today. We'll be tracing the roots of Irish identity, looking at centuries of invasion, oppression, and the Great Famine, the fight for independence, partition, and the Troubles, and finally wrapping things up with the modern Irish Renaissance.
Starting off with Section 1, The Roots of Irish Identity, covering 8000 BC right up to the early medieval period.
So the island's story actually kicks off around 8000 BC with Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. But you know what's truly mind-blowing? By 3200 BC, these early inhabitants were already building massive, incredibly complex megalithic tombs like Brú na Bóinne. To put that into perspective, these structures literally predate the Great Pyramids of Giza. Pretty wild, right? Then, skipping ahead a bit to 600 BC, the Celtic Iron Age arrives. And this is crucial, because it introduced a deeply stratified tribal society. We're talking high kings, regional chieftains, and complex legal systems. This really laid down the very first foundational layer of native Gaelic identity. Then, around the 5th century, figures like St. Patrick show up and introduce Christianity. But, and this is a big but, it wasn't some complete erasure of the old ways. Actually, as the historical record notes, Christianity flared so brilliantly in Ireland at a time when it had all but vanished from the eastern and northern fringes of the Roman Empire. What happened was these Irish monastic schools brilliantly merged the new Christian theology with native Gaelic myths and those tribal structures we just talked about. It created this totally distinctive Celtic Christianity. It was like a syncretic patchwork where monks basically became the new learned class, spending their time preserving ancient Irish history in these stunning illuminated manuscripts. Moving right along to Section 2, Centuries of Invasion, spanning from 1167 to 1691.
Now, things start to get really turbulent. In 1167, the Normans arrived under Strongbow, and that established a permanent English foothold. But the real turning point? That hits in 1536, when Henry VIII kicked off the Tudor conquest. He tried to force this surrender and re-grant policy, essentially trying to make Gaelic lords submit to English titles. And it just escalates from there. You get the utterly devastating Cromwellian invasion in 1649, and later the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. We have to remember, each of these events wasn't just a military conquest. They were massive forces that pushed profound political and, honestly, even more importantly, deep religious changes onto the native population.
Just look at the sheer demographic shift here. It is staggering. By the end of the 17th century, 66% of the land in Ulster was held by Protestant landlords. Compare that to just 34% held by native Irish and others. How did that happen? Well, it was the result of the plantation of Ulster. This was a deliberate policy of demographic engineering. Native Catholic landowners were systematically displaced and replaced with Protestant settlers brought over from Scotland and England. And this right here, this planted the very deep, very real seeds for the religious divisions that would haunt the island for centuries to come.
Which brings us to Section 3, Oppression and the Great Famine, covering the 18th to 19th century.
Following those military conquests, the new Protestant ascendancy enacted what were called the Penal Laws. These were designed to systematically marginalize the Catholic majority. Catholics were legally barred from inheriting estates or even practicing law. Protestant church attendance was legally mandated, and Catholic priests were literally banished. But as history shows us time and time again, oppression often breeds resilience, right? In response to all this, the Catholic population started forming secret underground parish clubs. So ironically, this systematic marginalization actually fueled a fiercely protective, retaliatory national identity that became completely intertwined with Catholicism. And then an absolute catastrophe struck. 1 million. That's the number to remember here. Starting in 1845, a devastating potato blight wiped out the primary food source for the rural poor. Over the next 5 years, during what became known as the Great Famine, 1 million people died of starvation and disease. It's hard to even wrap your head around that number. It was an utter demographic and social collapse that completely shattered the nation. And closely following that is this number, 2 million. That is the staggering number of people who fled the country in the decades right after the famine, creating an absolutely massive diaspora. Most of them sailed for America, landing in cities like New York and Boston. Now, this mass exodus obviously plummeted the population back home, But it also did something else. It fundamentally internationalized the Irish identity, seeding these incredibly strong, politically active Irish-American communities all the way across the Atlantic. All right, let's move to Section 4, the fight for independence from 1916 to 1921. Now, the push for independence really starts to escalate rapidly. It kicks into high gear with the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin. Now, militarily, it was initially a failure. But the incredibly harsh British crackdown and the execution of the Rising's leaders instantly turned them into martyrs. And that catalyzed massive public support. This public outrage translated directly into political action. By 1918, the nationalist Sinn Féin party just swept the elections, taking 73 of the 105 Irish seats. That overwhelming mandate led directly into the Anglo-Irish War from 1919 to 1921. It was a brutal guerrilla conflict, but it ultimately forced the British to the negotiating table. This leads us to Section 5 Partition and the Troubles from 1921 to 1998. So the result of those negotiations was the 1921 partition, which essentially split the island into two distinct entities. On one side, you have Northern Ireland. This consisted of 6 counties with a Protestant and Unionist majority, and it held the bulk of the island's industrialized territory. On the flip side, you have the Irish Free State. This was made up of 26 counties with a Catholic and nationalist majority, but its economy was largely agricultural. It's important to understand this wasn't just drawing a line on a map. It was the formal, physical separation of competing demographics and entirely different economic basis. But here's the crucial takeaway. That partition absolutely did not resolve the underlying tensions. For those living in Northern Ireland, centuries of these competing cultural narratives, combined with gerrymandering and systemic inequality, eventually boiled over, and this erupted into what became known as the Troubles. We're talking about a deeply tragic 30-year period of sectarian violence. It was essentially a deadly clash over those conflicting religious and national identities we've been tracking. But finally, after decades of heartbreak, a massive breakthrough arrived: the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. This was a monumental, and let me tell you, deeply complex compromise. It established a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland that structurally required both Unionist and nationalist participation. By officially prioritizing peace and the democratic process over violence, it effectively brought an end to the vast majority of the sectarian conflict, a true turning point. And that brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, the Modern Irish Renaissance, from the late 20th century to the present. In 1973, Ireland joined the European Economic Community, and this brilliantly illustrates the turning point for the modern era. Joining the EEC was the catalyst that forced the nation to abandon protectionism and pivot towards a highly open, liberal economy. By leveraging an educated English-speaking workforce and setting some really competitive corporate tax rates, Ireland started attracting massive foreign direct investment. In basically just a few decades, they completely transformed from a poorer, peripheral agricultural state into a highly developed global tech and pharmaceutical hub. Get this, 126%. During the absolute peak of this economic boom, which was famously dubbed the Celtic Tiger, modern Ireland's GDP per capita astonishingly reached 126% of the European Union average. I mean, that is an economic miracle that just completely rewrote the nation's standing on the global stage. But, it wasn't just about the money. It was about a profound cultural shift. This modern Irish Renaissance implied exactly that: rebirth and renewal. It was a new beginning rather than just trying to resuscitate the past. Ireland managed to pull off this amazing balancing act, successfully blending its ancient, deep-rooted traditions with a highly confident, incredibly modern, and international outlook. Today, the culture is a massive global export, celebrated not just for its rich history, but for its incredibly dynamic present. So if we look back from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to Celtic tribes enduring centuries of invasion, devastating famine, and bitter conflict, all the way to becoming a modern European powerhouse, the Irish identity has been constantly forged, tested, and reforged in the fires of history. So after millennia of struggle and finally securing a hard-won peace, what exactly will the next chapter of this incredible identity look like? Well, that is something the whole world will be watching to find out. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.